Hi, this is Paul. Last week I made a video and I used this thumbnail and I talked about the iconostasis. Now, Grim Grizz sort of said, yeah, but nobody knows what that word means. Well, that word is the wall between the altar and the place where the people gather. And of course, I had a number of really good comments from Orthodox people talking about how God moves out from behind the altar, out among his people. And of course, this has all tons of biblical reference. And part of, let's see, oh, my mic is a little too hot. Part of what I've been reading the book of Deuteronomy with my men's group. I've been preaching in the Old Testament on Sunday morning. And this whole business is, when you go into an Orthodox church, and, I first went to one in Southern California in Riverside, and I immediately began to understand why it's set up the way it's set up. And in many ways, it's set up in continuity with the tabernacle and the temple. And so and that's why you have the rail, and of course the Protestant Reformation. The church has been having a long conversation about space and images and people and holiness and all of these kinds of things. Now, if you understand that for many Americans, the story they are living is the story generated in Hollywood and presented to them by movies. Movies are one of the most powerful storytellers we have now. Movies with the images, movies with the soundtrack, movies with the story, movies with the actors. They're animated. Movies are this astoundingly powerful temple, story creator that is creating the stories within which most people in Western culture and many, many people in the entire world live in. Christian or non-Christian, we are deeply impacted by these movies and these stories. And I got at that a little bit in the Iconostasis movie, and then I used like Stories of Old, Tom Vanderlinde as an example of a preacher. So another one of the major YouTube preaching channels that I used their video on Utopia is a channel called Hello Future Me. I don't know, I'm often with these channels, they're playing around with YouTube and then the channel continues to evolve. The video I watched this morning was, I don't even see Why Heroes Fall. That's the one that Algo served up to me. And again, as I often read the comments about, oh, I can't keep up, how do I get in, what's the on-ramp, etc., etc., I sort of lean into Afriel's conversation about trust algo, and that it's by no means infallible, and I chose that word consciously. It's by no means infallible, but algo isn't a bad guide, given that it knows if you're logged into YouTube and you've decided to give, to a degree, your personal information and your personal life over to Google. It gives Google a fair amount of idea about what you've done, and sort of like a large language model, just uses the mathematical statistical relationships between how words are used. Algo uses a similar model in terms of other profiles that have liked things like you, comparing it to what they have watched. And so, again, YouTube algo is crowdsourcing. And so then the video, why, see, it hasn't even shown up for me here, maybe because it saw that I watched it. Here it is. Why Heroes Fall.
Rage, but also,
and it was I thought an excellent video because it went into the hero's journey, and you both have the hero, and then I thought, again, if the continual presentation of iconographic images from, here's the Joker, Dark Knight, and then had some other anime and manga stories that I had no idea about. But he's obviously then of course there's Lord of the Rings and there's Star Wars. He's a very good preacher, and I was watching Why We Love to Watch a Hero Fall. I was on writing. Okay. So in some ways, he's treading similar paths to Justin Wells. This is in many ways preaching, because he's taking the stories that are out there and the stories that people are living in, because we're not just living in one story. We're living in all sorts of fandoms and stories at the same time, and those stories are shaping our world. And so he, in that sense, the images on the screen are the iconostasis, and in that sense, the priest goes back behind the altar and comes out with this different language and brings it out to the people, and you have this back and forth transjective movement going on. I was Mark Parker recommended this new sitcom, romantic comedy, rom-com on Netflix that I started watching, and my wife and I watched the first 4 episodes, and there was a level of, let's say, sexual frankness. The movie didn't have nudity or sexually explicit things. The tide has sort of turned on that in our popular culture. Now it seems like in many of the most recent things, you can show male genitalia, you can show gay sex, but people don't want graphic descriptions or descriptions of heterosexual sex. It's very interesting the way these things sort of evolve. I've got a meeting coming up soon, so I have to keep an eye on what's going on. And I lose track of my thought. And so you've got all of the elements of how the church has been functioning, but it's sort of been moved onto YouTube, and it's been moved into movie theaters, and it's been moved into other realms. And in many ways, the church has sort of been left behind, at least in terms of popular participation as compared to the massive numbers. And it could, again, be, Tom Vandelindy says, well, cinema will always be with you. And it's like, in some ways, of course, video games have eclipsed that, but we've already sort of seen how it's divided, because men are into video games in a way that women aren't. Women are into rom-coms, men are into other kinds of heroes' journeys. And so actually we're seeing a battle of the media and the genres going on right now. Now, I thought the recent Lex Fridman-Jordan Peterson conversation was outstanding. Jordan, I think, was able to quickly articulate a number of things with the kind of clarity and focus that I don't think I've seen for a while. I mean, his emergence back in 2016, 2017, where he could leverage, years of past classroom debates. He was able, I think, he sort of had his fingers on the pulse of the culture and was articulating in a way in the culture that sort of captured a lot. And that was sort of his status rocket ride. Now, part of the difficulty is that the higher you go, the different boosters no longer work. But he showed so much of this conversation was so much better refined, clear, tight. And there was so much good stuff in this conversation. There's so many pieces of this conversation that we could treat. I'm leaving tonight for the East Coast, where I will be, having the estuary retreat at my sister's place in Connecticut. I don't know if there's any spots left in that or not. You'd have to go to the website to see. But one of the things that was so interesting was how he's always sort of read Abraham through the filter of the hero's journey. But what was interesting in this video is how he sort of universalized it, at least for men. And that, obviously was for me quite in keeping and sort of a good foil to deal with why we love to watch a hero fall, because there is, of course, the hero's journey, but all of our heroes fail at some point, except, of course, the archetype, who is Jesus. And I'm a Christian. That's sort of by definition, what your ideal is. Your ideal, if you're a Muslim, your ideal is Muhammad. If you're a Buddhist, your ideal is the Buddha, to a degree. And I know that there's a lot of nuance in there in terms of even how these different religions handle an ideal. But Christianity clearly deals with Jesus as the ideal, and that ideal then works out into the rest of the culture. Again, I'm keeping an eye on the parking lot because I've got pastors coming in, but I'm under the gun. So, and you say, well, you don't have to do a video today. No, I want to do a video today. I've got these ideas and I want to process them and I want to get them out to you so I can read the comment sections and hear how they filter in through the TLC. I don't do videos because somehow I feel I have an economic imperative to do them. I do them because I love doing them and because I want to process these things. As Sam said in his conversation, Sam hasn't been present because Sam just had a new baby. And so he's been busy with a new baby. But I do these things because I want to process these ideas with you.
The underlying neurophysiological architecture. So I can give you an example of that. So the hero myth is really a quest myth. And a quest myth is really a story of exploration and expansion of adaptation. Right, so Bilbo.
And again, we've had hero myths have been dominant in our culture. Part of how Tolkien sort of exploded and really afforded the creation of fantasy and its deep connection with science fiction. I think Damon Walter is right on that. Hero myths are just all over the culture, and of course there's a conversation about masculine hero myth and feminine hero myth, and then male and female characters in terms of the masculine and feminine, etc., etc. But here Peterson again ties, and this goes all the way back to what he did early on. He's tying story to biology. In many ways, that's sort of the linchpin of what Peterson has done, and why Peterson is so important at this juncture, because in modernity it's biology, 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 and then postmodernity sort of cast a skeptical eye on story and narrative and says, these are just made up BS. It's sort of like new atheists look at this and say, anything that you can't hold in your hand as physical material or touch as physical material is derivative and fictitious and of secondary importance. And one of the big reasons Peterson has had the contribution he's had is because he shifts that and says, no, the story verse and the physical verse are deeply tied.
The Hobbit, he's a kind of an ordinary everyman. He lives in a very constrained and orderly and secure world. And then the quest call comes and he goes out and he expands his personality and develops his wisdom. And that's reflected in human neuropsychological architecture at a very low level, way below cognition. So one of the most fundamental elements of the mammalian brain, and
again, way below cognition, because the idea, I was just reading up on some Nietzsche this morning, and it was interesting how all the AIs kept using wokish language to describe Nietzsche, and I thought, to what degree is the will to power responsible for the meme, it's all about power?
In lower animal forms is the hypothalamus. It's sort of the root of primary motivation. So it governs lust and it regulates your breathing, and it regulates your hunger, and it regulates your thirst, and it regulates your temperature. Like really low-level biological necessities are regulated by the hypothalamus. When you get hungry, it's the hypothalamus. When you're activated in a defensively aggressive manner, that's the hypothalamus. half the hypothalamus is the origin of the dopaminergic tracts, and they subsume exploration. And so you could think of the human motivational reality as a domain that's governed by axiomatic motivational states, love, sex, defensive aggression, hunger, and another domain that's governed by exploration. And the rule would be something like, when your basic motivational states are sated, explore. Well, and then, and that's not cognitive. Like I said, this is deep, deep brain architecture.
Because, of course, Schopenhauer first looked at survival, and Nietzsche responds to Schopenhauer and says, is it survival or is it something else? And, of course, he uses will to power. I'm deeply tempted to lay down money for Peterson Academy because I'm really curious about what Peterson does with Nietzsche. I realized a few weeks ago that I have failed to post all of the 2003 Breakwater conference, the plenary sessions of that. Aaron, who teaches philosophy at Leiden in the Netherlands, gave what to me was one of the most helpful introductions to Nietzsche. So I'm going to post that on my channel. But you can see sort of, say, Schopenhauer and then Nietzsche, because Nietzsche points out that whatever Nietzsche means by the will to power, and I think it's more sophisticated than just sort of the reduction of power to coercion. Nietzsche's trying to get words around, and I wish I knew German because I know enough about languages to know that there's got to be better and worse translations of Nietzsche. And as time goes, people will keep translating Nietzsche just like they keep translating Augustine or the Bible or Homer, because language is a very living thing. And so when you have an older text, you've always got to wrestle with what the language meant in that place and what the language means now and find the way between them.
It's extraordinarily ancient. And the exploration story is something like, go out into the unknown and take the risks, because the information that you discover and the skills you develop will be worthwhile even in sating the basic motivational drives. And then you want to learn to do that in a iterative manner, so it sustains across time, and you want to do it in a way that unites you with other people. And there's a pattern to that, and I do think...
And again, he used to talk about Piaget with respect to that, the equilibrated state. And again, it's got to be iterative, it's got to go through time, and it's got to go span out through people. And so again, Peterson is returning to a bunch of these themes that I think were really important in terms of his breakthrough in 2016, 2017. And he's done all of this work on We Who Wrestle with God and on some of these other biblical stories. And you can see that he's continued to refine a lot of these things.
I think that's the pattern we strive to encapsulate in our deep religious narratives. And I think that in many ways we've done that successfully.
What is the belief in God? How does that fit in? What does it mean to believe in God?
Well, okay, so in one of the stories that I cover in We Who Wrestle...
Now, people have been asking Peterson this question all the way back to 2016, because when they saw that he's dealing over there, and then okay, what this belief in God? And I think Peterson has been right in terms of, I think he's been effective in sort of blunting that question again and again, for the reasons he states, and I think they're true, that, you want to pigeonhole me in a religious or non, and what I want to do is I want to explode these categories a little bit, because these categories have not been helping us. And now Lex asks the same question, but he asks it now in a conversation, in a context, at a point where Peterson is comfortable connecting these terms, because he's sort of laid out within his sphere, within his domain. In many ways, this is the proper time to ask the question.
With God, which I only recently began.
How does that fit in? What does it mean to believe in God?
Well, okay, so in one of the stories that I cover in We Who Wrestle with God, which I only recently begun to take apart, say in the last 2 years, is the story of Abraham. And it's a very cool story. And it's also related, by the way, to your question about what makes communism wrong. And Dostoevsky knew this, not precisely the Abraham story, but the same reason. In Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky made a very telling observation. So he speaks in the voice of a cynical, nihilistic, and bitter bureaucrat who's been a failure, who's talking cynically about the nature of human beings, but also very accurately. And one of the things he points out with regards to modern utopianism is that human beings are very strange creatures, and that if you gave them what the socialist utopians want to give them, so let's say all your needs are taken care of, all your material needs are taken care of, and even indefinitely. Dostoevsky's...
All right, I'm going to have to pause everything here because people are starting to arrive for my meeting. Hopefully I'll get back to this afternoon. I'll be able to post this. I'm going to be gone for a week or so, which means that you're not going to see me with this background. I don't know what I'm going to be able to do on the road with respect to content on the channel. I've got some older stuff that I'm going... So you're going to get reruns in some ways. But it's because I know the way YouTube and the algorithm and channels work. For some of you, a lot of these reruns will be new. For others of you, it will be seen. I'm going to try to add some value-added stuff up front, similar to what I've been doing with the Northwest Jory content. And now this is dropping here in the middle of the video, which probably isn't a great place, but hey, why start being a quality content creator now?
Claim was, you don't understand human beings very well, because if you put them in an environment that was that comfortable, they would purposefully go insane just to break it into bits, just so something interesting would happen. Right. And he says it's the human proclivity to curse and complain. And he says this in quite a cynic and caustic manner, but he's pointing to something deep, which is that we're not built for comfort and security. We're not infants. We're not after satiation. So then you might ask, well, what the hell are we after then? That's what the Abraham story addresses. And
you know, part of the reason I do this video thing and I talk about these is it forces me to listen to things multiple times. And when I listen multiple times, I hear different things and think different things bounce off at me. I'm playing with Notebook LM to do summaries and things, see if that helps me. Actually, I found it hasn't helped me at all, because it's in the listening to it that insights get sparked. And he makes the point, which seems like an obvious point, and I made that with the me in the future video on utopianism in the previous video. Hello Future Me, that video, when he had this video about Ursula Le Guin and utopianism. Why do we assume we are made for comfort? That's a really interesting dynamic, because so often there's these assumptions that are around, and they're just there. They're just assumptions. They're just expectations. We don't explore them. We don't analyze them. We don't question them. We don't do anything like that. And what he says here is Dostoevsky seems right. Now, again, you might say, well, what is the source of that in us? And then you have sort of the very low resolution nature nurture. And you get the will to power, this is just, you know, sort of back to a Rousseauian assumption that this is just how we have been shaped by our society. And what's interesting about the nature nurture question is it is very seldom purely one or the other. It is almost always transjective between them.
Abraham is the first true individual in the biblical narrative. So you could think about his story as the archetypal story of the developing individual. So you said, well, what's God? Well, in the Abraham story, God is characterized a lot of different ways in the classic religious texts. Like the Bible is actually a compilation of different characterizations of the divine, with the insistence that they reflect an underlying unity. In the story of Abraham, the divine is the call to adventure. So Abraham has the socialist utopia at hand. He's from a wealthy family, And he has everything he needs. And he actually doesn't do anything until he's in his 70s. Now, hypothetically, people in those times lived much longer. But a voice comes to Abraham and it tells him something very specific. It says, leave your zone of comfort. Leave your parents, leave your tent, leave your community, leave your tribe, leave your land. Go out into the world. And Abraham thinks, well, why? I've got naked slave girls peeling grapes and feeding them to me. It's like, what do I need an adventure for? And God tells them, and this is the covenant, by the way, part of the covenant that the God of the Israelites makes with his people. It's very, very specific. It's very brilliant. He says, if you follow the voice of adventure, you'll become a blessing to yourself. So that's a good deal because people generally live at odds with themselves. And he says, God says, that's not all. You'll become a blessing to yourself in a way that furthers your reputation among people and validly, so that you'll accomplish things that were real and people will know it and you'll be held high in their esteem and that will be valid. So that's a pretty good deal because social people would like to be regarded as of utility and worth by others, and so that's a good deal. And God says, that's not all. You'll establish something of lasting, permanent, and deep value. That's why Abraham becomes the father of nations.
Now, I've heard him run through his Abraham analysis a number of times. And on one hand, it's a very fresh analysis. I don't think I've ever heard an analysis like this, partly because I was raised in a tradition that had a set analysis for this already, and this is very different. What was interesting to me about this time through with Peterson is I could see much better how he tied sort of the hero's journey to the biblical story, and Abraham is a key part of that nexus. Now what he says often is that the Hebrew Bible presents a variety of spirits, and all of those spirits actually come together. He says that earlier in this video. He says it far better than I just did. And so, of course, the Abrahamic hero's journey story is pretty key in this because Abraham is very key in terms of the development of the biblical story. Because right before Abraham, the previous major player before Abraham is really Noah. And Noah presents basically a calamity in terms of the story of earth and a fresh beginning. And the end of Noah is the Tower of Babel. And after that, you have the election of Abraham. And of course, whereas, say, Calvinist traditions will tend to lean into the election of Abraham and the election of the nation Israel, Peterson sort of leans it as here the hero's journey is available to all, and Abraham picked up on it rather than, let's say, the call of God, which is interesting in the story because, of course, if you're looking for a candidate to be the father of nations, the last person you would pick would be someone who is 75 years old and is with a wife of 65 years and they're barren. And part of what's interesting about Jordan Peterson's telling of the story is that most of the tension in the biblical account clearly centers on Abram and Sarai having a child, whereas Jordan's telling of the story and sort of telling of the Abrahamic story as a hero's journey doesn't really bear much on the miraculous conception of Isaac. And so it's interesting that I can see, I don't think Jordan's telling of the Abrahamic story is in any ways illegitimate. I think that is an aspect to the story where Abraham is called out of the land that he knew, and he's called into a land of uncertainty. And so you can take the Abrahamic story and attach it to the hero's journey. But textually, that story much more focuses on what for Abraham is the crisis of barrenness. And that crisis of barrenness, of course, will be a theme throughout. Isaac and Rebekah will suffer from infertility. We can use modern parlance. Rachel will suffer from infertility. At the beginning of the book of Samuel, Hannah is barren and suffering from infertility. So this is a key theme, and it's a theme in terms of God's electing intervention into the story and the new way in which God changes the story from all of the usual ways he does. Now, again, that being said, psychologically speaking, Jordan has a strong case here. Because psychologically speaking, as individuals, again, these are two frames that are in some ways, they are not, you did not have psychology at the time of the text. We have psychology now. We tend to read the Bible with psychological eyes. And what's amazing is that it continues to hold up. But it's interesting the way he works this hero's journey and uses the text in that way when, again, you cannot read the Abraham cycle. What I mean by the Abraham cycle, that's sort of the story of Abraham from beginning to end. So you have the Isaac cycle and the Jacob cycle. It's just sort of nomenclature that's used in biblical studies. But you cannot read the story of Abraham without noticing in the book of Genesis the dominant interest in, will he have a son? Will that son be through Sarah? Because all of the other stories of the sequence, when Abraham denies that Sarah is his wife, you have the threat of a king impregnating Sarah, and then that ruins the promise. Or Hagar and Ishmael, and that ruins the promise. And so again, biblically, the key element in that story is the birth of Isaac, not so much the focus on Abraham and his hero's journey.
And finally, he caps it off, and he says there's a better element even to it. There's a capstone. You'll do all three of those things in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. And so the divinity in the Abrahamic story is making a claim. He says, first of all, there's a drive that you should attend to, so the spirit of adventure that calls you out of your zone of comfort. Now, if you attend to that and you make the sacrifices necessary to follow that path, then the following benefits will accrue to you. Your life will be a blessing. Everyone will hold you in high esteem. You'll establish something of permanent value, and you'll do it in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. And so think about what this means biologically or from an engineering standpoint. It means that the instinct to develop that characterizes outward moving children, let's say, or adults, is the same instinct that allows for psychological stability, that allows for movement upward in a social hierarchy, that establishes something iterable, and that does that in a manner that allows everyone else to partake in the same process. Well, that's a good deal. And I can't see how it cannot be true, because the alternative hypothesis would be that the spirit that moves you beyond yourself to develop, the spirit of a curious child, let's say, what is that antithetical to your own esteem? Is that antithetical to other people's best interest? Is it not the thing that increases the probability that you'll do something permanent? That's a stupid theory.
So God is a call to adventure with some constraints.
A call to true adventure.
To true adventure.
Yeah, and then...
Now, a couple videos ago, I talked about basically God is that which, it's sort of the Christian hedonist argument. God is that which satisfies completely and eternally. All right. God is a call to adventure. It's key here that Peterson says, well, it's vital to have, how can I say this? If you go back and you listen to Peterson talk about how we see and perceive the world, meaning comes before materiality. We see objects, we see opportunities and obstacles. That's something that he said a number of years ago. And so in this sense, when we are asking about this, in English, this little three-letter word, God, God is that which satisfies us maximally. God is that which calls us to adventure. And what he's done, I can't wait to read this book. What he's done is basically taken a whole bunch of these things and lined them up and said, we've sort of had this little boxed-in, framed-in conversation about God, and it's really not gone well, and it hasn't been terribly helpful. In fact, this goes all the way back to his conversation with Sam Harris and my God number 1 and God number 2. Okay, this was the moment right here, and I think in many ways you could see what Jordan was doing and where he was going on this moment. And what struck me by this moment is Sam couldn't see it at all. And that's where I said, Sam is debating this God number 2, God as agent. And Jordan sees God as arena in some ways. And you can see that as the animating spirit behind all of what God is in these different stories. And again, if we see first opportunity and obstacles, if we see meaning first and materiality second, then this makes a lot of sense.
Just as they were to him.
So in what sense do you mean, what is the God that you act as though he, she, it exists? And what is the God-shaped thing I must have in my life to prevent me from being a, quote, real atheist?
Well, okay, first of all, I have to point out that there's no possible way I can answer both those questions in 2 minutes.
Well, it's the same question.
But,
I mean,
yeah,
what do you mean by God?
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you some of the things that I mean by God. Okay?
We do have to get the question.
Maybe we're going to do this tomorrow.
Yeah, maybe this is where we start. Oh, God. Well, that was a pretty resounding no.
It seems like that constitutes an audience question, wouldn't you say?
All right, I tell you what. Let's... let's do this, but let's be deliberate about time.
Okay. Well, I'm going to read some things that I wrote because it's so complicated that I'm not sure that I can just spin it off the top of my head, and so you'll have to excuse me. And what I'm going to do is sort of paint a picture by highlighting different things. So now I already made one point here. I made the point that part of the conception of God that underlies the Western ethos is the notion that whatever God is expressed in the truthful speech that rectifies pathological hierarchies. And that isn't all it does. It also confronts the chaos of being itself and generates habitable order. That's the metaphysical proposition. And that's best conceptualized as at least one element of God. And so I would think about it as a transcendent reality that's only observable across the longest of time frames, the longest of iterated time frames, to your point. So here's some propositions, and they're complicated, and they need to be unpacked. So I'm just going to read them, and that'll have to do for the time being. So God is how we imaginatively and collectively represent the existence and action of consciousness across time, as the most real aspects of existence manifest themselves across the longest of time frames, but are not necessarily apprehensible as objects in the here and now. So what that means in some sense is that you have conceptions of reality built into your biological and metaphysical structure that are a consequence of processes of evolution that occurred over unbelievably vast expanses of time, and that structure your perception of reality in ways that it wouldn't be structured if you only lived for the amount of time that you're going to live. And that's also part of the problem of deriving values from facts, because you're evanescent and you can't derive the right values from the facts that portray themselves to you in your lifespan, which is why you have a biological structure that's like 3.5 billion years old. So God is that which eternally dies and is reborn in the pursuit of higher being and truth. That's a fundamental element of hero mythology. God is the highest value in the hierarchy of values. That's another way of looking at it. God is what calls and what responds in the eternal call to adventure. God is the voice of conscience. God is the source of judgment and mercy and guilt. God is the future to which we make sacrifices and something akin to the transcendental repository of reputation. Here's a cool one if you're an evolutionary biologist. God is that which selects among men in the eternal hierarchy of men. So, you know, men arrange themselves into hierarchies and then...
Now, what's interesting about, what year was this? 28. What did you do this? 2017 or 2018? Oh, was there a 6 years ago, 2018? I wish... Oh, August 31, 2018. Okay, good. Well, now I know. If it says 6 years ago, I was like, they should give us the date. But if you mouse over it, you get the date. What's interesting about the change in Peterson from then to now, whenever he goes into the question of God, he turns to the Bible, which is super interesting. And he uses the Bible stories. And now part of that, of course, is the book that he's written. But if you understand what he's doing right here, and you understand what he's doing with Lex Fridman, he's sort of doing the same thing. We'll let him finish, and then you see Sam's right here ready to jump.
Men rise in the hierarchy, and there's principles that are important that determine the probability of their rise, and those principles aren't tyrannical power. They're something like the ability to articulate truth and the ability to be competent and the ability to make appropriate moral judgments. And if you can do that in a given situation, then all the other men will vote you up the hierarchy, so to speak, and that will radically increase your reproductive fitness. And the operation of that process across long expanses of time looks to me like it's codified in something like the notion of God the Father. It's also the same thing that makes men attractive to women, because women peel off the top of the male hierarchy, and the question is what should be at the top of the hierarchy, and the answer right now is tyranny as part of the patriarchy, but the real answer is something more like the ability to use truthful speech in the service of, let's say, well-being. And so that's something that operates across tremendous expanses of time, and it plays a role in the selection for survival itself, which makes it a fundamental reality.
Jordan, can I just cut in here with one question?
I'll stop with that for now.
Okay, so again, God number one and God number two. All of those things that Jordan read are factors that they are arenic in nature. Okay? They are arenic in nature. And now Sam's going to pivot and basically ask questions. Is this agentic in that?
So I was not hearing in that list of attributes a God who could care if anyone masturbated. I was not hearing.
Notice, again, care. And if you go back to the Vervaeke, Peugeot, Jordan Hall, as that conversation climaxed, it really got into the question of care. Now, care, again, is an arenic quality. It's a quality of consciousness and intentionality and attention. And again in the Bible, often God's saving acts are listed in terms of attention. And God remembered Noah, and God remembered his covenant, and God remembered. It's always framed in a question of attention.
Hearing a God who
depends on what else is stopping you from doing, Sam.
Sorry, I missed that.
I said it depends on what else it's stopping you from doing.
Well, yeah, okay. So it's important to live.
But seriously,
it's important to do something other than masturbate.
Yes. Yes, which actually constitutes a problem for many people.
Which is harder than it sounds.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing a God, a personal God who can possibly hear anyone's prayers, much less answer them, right? And I'm wondering what percentage of religious people who would say, "Oh yeah, I believe in God and it's the most important thing in my life." What percentage of those religious people do you think have in mind a God of the sort you just described?
I don't know, Sam. It's a good question, because when I go talk to people, when I talk to people online and use exactly this terminology, millions of people listen. So it's not so obvious what percentage of people see it this way. It may be that they have the intuitions, but they haven't been articulated well.
And it was at that point when I was listening to Jordan and I was thinking about far older, especially pre-Reformational descriptions of God that were still in Reformational confessions, hymnody. That's when I began to notice, oh, part of what's been happening is this shift away from God number one, and that was sort of replaced, God number one was sort of replaced by deism, a clockmaker universe, and that all that was left in many ways was God number two, number two, number two. So it was always God's personal qualities, God's attentive qualities, and then you're sort of left with questions of, I also noticed that the problem of evil. There have been multiple iterations of the problem of evil over time, but if you look at, Tim Keller points this out in his book on suffering, that the destruction of Lisbon by a tsunami, earthquake, and fire sort of catalyzed this, because how could God let this city be destroyed when it was such a good city, such a Christian city? And that the tsunami happened, I believe, the destruction happened on a Sunday when people were in church, et cetera, et cetera. And so that then again focused on the ongoing imaginative projection that God is sort of like us, but bigger, hanging around on a cloud, maybe with a big arm, gonna touch Adam's finger. So when we get to 2024, the focus very much is illustrations are much more biblical. And it's really interesting because I think what he's done, all those abstractions that he listed in Vancouver in 2018, now he's got these biblical stories that are way built into the foundation of our culture.
That's a good observation, because that begs the question, what constitutes the most true adventure? Well, that's not fully fleshed out until, at least from the Christian perspective, let's say, that's not fully fleshed out until the Gospels, because the passion of Christ is you could say, this is the perfectly reasonable way of looking at it, the passion of Christ is the truest adventure of Abraham. That's a terrible thing, because the passion story is a catastrophic tragedy, although it obviously has its redemptive element.
And now what he's doing, again, he's been spending a lot of time with Christians, especially in these seminars. And part of what he's picked up is this very Christian tradition where, you can find it in Tim Keller, Jesus is the perfected Moses. Jesus is the perfected David. Jesus is the perfected Abraham. Jesus is the perfected Noah. So you see all of these Bible stories finding their completion then in the Christ story, which takes all of these stories and brings them together. Now, he's not saying that directly, but it seems to be what he's doing.
But one of the things that's implied there is that there's no distinction between the true adventure of life and taking on the pathway of maximal responsibility and burden. And I can't see how that cannot be true. Because the counter hypothesis is, well, Lex, the best thing for you to do in your life is to shrink from all challenge and hide, right? To remain infantile, to remain secure, not to ever push yourself beyond your limits, not to take any risks. Well, no one thinks that's true.
So basically, the maximally worthwhile adventure could possibly be highly correlated with the hardest possible available adventure.
The hardest possible available adventure voluntarily undertaken.
Does it have to be
voluntary? It has
voluntary?
to be absolutely.
How do you define voluntarily?
Well, here's an example of that. That's a good question too.
Now, many of our challenges, now voluntarily undertaken should not be equated with chosen. Because in my experience, for most people, we have a succession of challenges through our life. maybe the most difficult challenge, they're seldom chosen. We can use Jordan Peterson will use his illness in, from 2018 to 2021, roughly 2019 to 2022, something in there. He says 3 years, and his 3 years, I think, are sort of like Christ's 3 days in the tomb. They're parts of 3 different years, but I don't know for sure because, he's not telling us exactly what's going on medically for himself, which is absolutely fine. None of us should be just spewing this stuff up. It's not relevant. But he didn't say, I'm going to suffer akathisia and have constant pain, and by the time I get ready for bed, I feel better, but then I have to sleep, and the next morning it starts all over again. It's sort of a sick, inverted Groundhog Day. He didn't choose that. The voluntarism comes in that I am not going to kill myself, and I am not going to become bitter. There's the key. And for many people, this moment of this big challenge that they're going to face, and of course people face multiple big challenges in their life, they're going to have to face it with a posture of voluntarism in which they decide to not simply passively suffer, but actively engage. Now, actively engage means you're going to figure out at least the way in which you actively engage it, because what I find on the internet is that a lot of people think that engagement only means one thing, and that one thing usually is speaking angrily against it, that that's somehow the only way to counter something.
When Christ is the night before the crucifixion, which in principle he knows is coming, he asks God to relieve him of his burden, and understandably so. I mean, that's the scene famously in which he's literally sweating blood, because he knows what's coming. And the Romans designed crucifixion to be the most agonizing and humiliating possible, humiliating, and disgusting possible death. Right, so there was every reason to be apprehensive about that. And you might say, well, could you undertake that voluntarily as an adventure? And the answer to that is something like, well, what's your relationship with death? Like, that's a problem you have to solve. And you could fight it, and you could be bitter about it, and there's reasons for that, especially if it's painful and degrading. But the alternative is something like, well, it's what's fleshed out in religious imagery always. It's very difficult to cast into words. It's like, no, you welcome the struggle. That's why I called the book We Who Wrestle with God. You welcome the struggle. And Lex, I don't see how you can come to terms with life without construing it as something like, bring it on, welcome the struggle. And I can't see that there's a limit to that. It's like, well, I welcome the struggle until it gets difficult. Well,
so there's not a bell curve, like the struggle in moderation. Basically, you have to welcome whatever as hard as it gets, and the crucifixion in that way is a symbol
of that. Well, and it's worse than that in some ways, because the crucifixion exemplifies the worst possible death. But that isn't the only element of the struggle, because mythologically, classically, after Christ's death, he harrows hell. And what that means, as far as I can tell, psychologically, is that you're not only required, let's say, to take on the full existential burden of life and to welcome it, regardless of what it is, and to maintain your upward aim despite all temptations to the contrary, but you also have to confront the root of malevolence itself. So it's not merely tragedy. And I think the malevolence is actually worse. And the reason I think that is because I know the literature on post-traumatic stress disorder. And most people who encounter, let's say, a challenge that's so brutal that it fragments them, it isn't mere suffering that does that to people. It's an encounter with malevolence that does that to people. Their own sometimes, often, by the way. Soldier will go out into a battlefield and find out that there's a part of him that really enjoys the mayhem. And that conceptualization doesn't fit in well with everything he thinks he knows about himself and humanity. And after that contact with that dark part of himself, he never recovers. That happens to people. And it happens to people who encounter bad actors in the world too. If you're a naive person and the right narcissistic psychopath comes your way, you are in like mortal trouble because you might die, but that's not where the trouble ends.
If there's a young man in their 20s listening to this, how do they escape the pull of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground? With the eyes open to the world, how do they select the adventure?
So there's other characterizations of the divine, say, in the Old Testament stories. So one pattern of characterization that I think is really relevant to that question is the conception of God as calling and conscience. Okay, so what does it mean? It's a description of the manner in which your destiny announces itself to you. And I'm using that terminology. And
again, notice he used the past tense. It announces itself to you. It comes to you. Because I think, again, part of what we've done in our culture is we have imagined that you sit back and you pick it. It's from a menu and you decide. Now, obviously, there is deciding. But what deciding usually does is put us on a road. And if you listen to a lot of his Daily Wire last half hour interviews with people, then he'll usually get more into how did this thing find you? And this was Christian Baxter's first conversation with Stephen Osborne's journey. And I love this conversation. Part of why I love this conversation is Stephen told his story very well. And he talked about his father was a physicist, his mother was an artist. He went to a school guidance counselor, and the guidance counselor kept pushing him towards STEM things. But he's like, yeah, but it's also the art thing that I want to keep. And he's got this real sense of taste and smell. It's a very, he's a synesthetic, and that it's a very big thing for him. And he spent basically 30 years getting to the place where he is now in terms of like making wine. The whole video, I learned a ton about winemaking and about scents. And then when he comes into orthodoxy, it all sort of comes together. It's just a fascinating conversation. And it's a great conversation about not lying, about telling the truth. I should play that little part.
Oh, graduated college. How are we going to do a wine? You know, I don't have a lot of money, and you know, these things cost a lot of money. So basically, it was about 30. Well, it was like 25 years from that epiphany, having dinner with, before I had figured out how to build a winery and a distillery. So
40 years. So
or 30, no, 25 years.
Before you figured out how to do what?
Well, I didn't have any money.
Yeah.
Right. And the way that what I wanted to do paintings of flavor. So that sounds suspiciously non-commercial, you know. Yeah. If you go to UC Davis and study winemaking like I did, they're going to think, what is going on with this guy? You know, why doesn't he just make wine and have kids and send them to UC Davis? Right. Mm-hmm. And I thought, no, I want to do art. You know, I want to do this art thing. So I ended up back in New York. And then how do you get a bank interested in loaning you a lot of money? You know, it took 20 years to get enough cred to be able to go to a bank. My wife and I haven't mentioned my wife, but my wife and I, to get enough credentials that you could go to a bank and say, you know,
legit. We're legit.
We're legit. We want to do something very different. It's not going to be as profitable, and we're going to be upfront about it. You know.
Yeah.
I don't like being deceptive, and my wife is much less. She just is not deceptive. She won't be deceptive. So we're in the bank trying to get a big loan for something that is kind of shaky, and whenever I say something that sounds a little too enticing, she says, "Oh well, Steve's trying to make it sound better because he wants your money." And I'm like, "Oh my God, yeah, you know, seriously." Well, yeah. But if you know, what's the point? What's the point of deception? You know,
so what does it look like?
What's the point of having heavy metal sulfides painting in your pine tree pigment? You know, why don't we be more truthful about this? But anyway, we ended up getting a bank to lend us way more money than they ever should have. I don't know. I'm still surprised that they lent us money, but we had bought some land before 9/11 near New York City. And then post 9/11, the value of the land had gone 10 times. And so we financed this place on a bubble of the land price, really. It wasn't that we were really good at telling the bank how they should loan us. It was that they looked at the piece of property and said, well, when this fails, we own this really nice piece of property.
We see the asset beneath the ideas. So so y'all have been doing this for almost 30 years.
We've been here like 20 years now. We've been open 20 years, making just, like I said, we have like right now it's 86 different spirits. So I have 86 different paintings for spirits, and then somewhere around 30 different wines.
Wow.
So,
I'm gonna have some fun with this story because this was just a great story.
Natural thing, but of course it's not a natural thing. It is an art, and that's another thing in itself. I was talking about that processing that we do in the wine industry. We're growing European grapes because they taste better processed. It doesn't mean that it's not good. It means that it's art. I mean, Van Gogh's Starry Night is processed as chemically a process the night sky as you're ever going to find. But we know it's an artistic thing. We don't burn it because it's a processed thing. So that's kind of how I think about like when people say, well, you're really against processed wines. No, I'm not. It's art. The problem is the industry is telling you it's nature. The industry is trying to convince you that Van Gogh's Starry Night is the night sky. And in general, they can get away with it. And if you're a truth guy, right, you're like, this is just so non-ideal. The wine and the spirits have a beautiful nature and a beautiful art, and people don't know how to discern between the two because the industry is getting away with telling them that art is nature. They're telling them that mom is dad. They're telling the industry is telling you that mom is dad. I'm like, I can't. This is just too much.
That makes me wonder if your attraction to Grimm is based on his history of being a truther and loving, like what is the truth of reality, like in society.
Probably, and his mystical, his non-revealing. And because I couldn't figure out what he was talking about, when I first started listening to him, I'm like, I mean, something in me was figuring it out, but it wasn't my conscious me. But then, what got me with Grimm, first of all, he was doing those dice rolls and he was doing chakras, right? He's like doing this chakra stuff. And I've been through the chakra thing with flavor. I've actually created a chakra-specific absinthe. So that sounds bizarre, but I have these chakra-specific. So there's herbs associated with the different chakras, and I was accentuating herbs that are used in absinthe to make chakra-specific herb-enhanced absinthes. It was a lot of fun. I was really trying to get better conversations with my customers by igniting a sort of a religious sense in them, and I didn't think that my customers were Christians. I thought that they were more really interested in Eastern religions, right? Because that seems to be what you see more and more of. So I thought, well, I'll create.
And at this point, he's not a Christian at all.
These chakra-specific absinthes, and I'll get better conversations. I'll get religious conversations, and then I can say, oh, well, did you know the chakras are aligned to spices? And then they can teach me something, because and I thought this is going to be great. So I went through this. This was before I found the church, right? I was sort of playing around with that. And what I discovered, it was really funny. What I discovered is generally for my customers, when I gave them this idea and presented them the flavors, generally what came out was they would shift the conversation to Christianity, right? They didn't really know a lot about chakras. It surprised me. But they would shift it towards, and I thought, I should probably do some spirits that had some kind of Christian theme to them. So,
this is where our conversation started.
Yeah, so I started to get these more truthful conversations, right? These more depth in the conversations. So, but anyway, so Grimm is rolling the dice with the chakras, and I thought, oh, what if we apply that? What if we apply that to like saints? what if I get a list of saints, and then when he pulls a card or something or rolls a dice, I can attach a saint to it rather than a chakra, because this is the way that I had been sort of going in my professional. I don't know if this makes any sense, but so then I started studying saints, not because of him, but I think because I was doing more flavor things. I was actually studying saints before meeting Pajot and the whole thing. So by the time I was involved with Grimm, I was sort of getting involved with the church. I knew a lot of saints. I had 52 that all no problem. So I made a list of 52 saints, and if you note, I still do that when he pulls cards. In the comments I always attach a saint to the card, and I didn't think anybody was watching or anything, and so I stopped doing it. And then Grimm says, "Hey, what are you doing? You stop doing the saints." So, well, nobody likes the saints. He goes, "I like the saints." I said, "Really?" Okay, so, but I think that it ended up being a really transformative thing for him. That idea of the randomness of the dice deciding who the saints were going to be, right? And so I started doing in my own life. This is at the time about the time I was starting to go to this Orthodox church. In the morning, I would roll dice to get saints for the day. And I would think about how those saints might be interrelated, like what did they have in common, or how were they related, and maybe make a little story during the day, thinking about, from the random roll. But I think there's a lot to that. I think that the things are much more, the generation of the kernel of generation is more random than we think, and that the germination of like stories and things can be from a sort of a random event in the beginning, leading to us sort of pulling together a story out of it and creating a context for that, such that we can live it out, we can embody it.
That's a huge part of Jordan Peterson's foundation for the meaning crisis. I mean, one of the things that he was trying to get people to do, young men to do, was make a simple narrative arc for your life.
Right.
But you're doing it in a very much more kind of mystical way, incorporating these things, and so it's a deeper level of that. But our culture is so vacuous when it comes to meaning that just sitting down and taking 30 minutes to construct a narrative for your life is, no one's calling us.
I think it might be. I've never done this and haven't thought about it. But if write down on a piece of paper like 20.
I love this idea.
20 events in your life, and don't worry about the order. Just write 20 events, and then take a 20-sided die and roll it 3 times, and pick the 3 that come up, and see how you are the same person, or see if those 3 don't lead to a spark. Oh, well, that gives me some sort of like, maybe I'm just guessing,
sure,
because it really did that with me and these saints things. It's and if you want a defense against the dark arts, I don't understand how saints aren't a good way of doing it. And you could say, well, saints can have a dark side, and that's true, but that, and you can hopefully, it's a known thing that you can filter. It's not like you can use this known thing that's partly dark, right, to defend yourself against things that are dark in an unknown way. I don't know if that.
I think that's right. I was having conversations with my wife about, it's you have to accept your shadow side. You can't suppress it. If you suppress it, it'll kind of take over. But you have to be able to look at it and face it and deal with it and understand it. And that's what that makes me think of.
You end up seeing it in everybody you look at, right?
Projecting it.
You start, oh, that person's acting bad, and it really bothers me. Like, what's going on with that? Well, when that happens to me nowadays, like when I see something, it's like there's I have some emotional, like negative reaction. So, okay, the thing that I'm reacting to is probably the thing in me.
Mm.
It's probably the thing in me that I don't like, because it doesn't make any sense. Like, well, I don't know anything about this person. Why would I? I think that, and if you know what's, and then as you do these things, as you know what's wrong in you, then you won't make the mistake of mischaracterizing somebody, of giving them a false
Label.
yeah, you don't want to label them incorrectly because of your own faults.
So whenever we talked first, you told me that frankincense played a big role.
And he goes, and I played a little bit. But the whole conversation, actually said 4 conversations with Stephen. But I thought this was really nice. Even when you read the Bible, if you sit down and you read Genesis, the timing is enormously compressed. It is throughout the Bible. If you read the Bible closely, even, let's say, from the death of Saul to the coronation of David and his consolidation of power in Jerusalem, I was just preaching about that. There's years in there. If you read the book of Acts, often you read it and it seems like this. There's years in there. And what I loved about this conversation, and why I thought this conversation was so valuable, is this movement is you have to be tremendously patient with this movement, because it takes real time, and we're not a very patient culture. So, well, that's maybe enough for this. Again, I'll put the links to all the videos below. There's a lot. The video I started with, that was a good video, and I'm gonna watch more of Hello Future Me. He seems to have a lot of good, why revolutions are hard to write. You start on the craft of the perfect story, and again, Justin Wells is doing a ton of this kind of stuff on his channel. So, yeah, really interesting stuff. So, leave a comment. Let me know what you think.